الحمد لله وكفى والسلام على عباده الذين اصطفى أما بعد فأعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الله ولي الذين آمنوا سبحان ربك رب العزة أما يصفون والسلام على المرسلين والحمد لله رب العالمين اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد وعلى آل سيدنا محمد وبارك وسلم اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد وعلى آل سيدنا محمد وبارك وسلم اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد وعلى آل سيدنا محمد وبارك وسلم. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala states in His glorious book, Allahu waliyul ladhina amanu. And it's also one of the lines that we often recite in our weekly gathering. Here Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is establishing that for the person who believes, there is a state called wilaya. Wilaya basically means to attain a degree of proximity to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala such that you become someone who is recognized and someone who is beloved to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So that's called wilaya, or becoming a wali of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They translate it often in English as being the friend of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So here Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala establishes that He is the wali. Allahu waliyul ladhina amanu. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the protecting friend of those people who believe. Now Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala establishes this relationship with those people who believe, meaning He becomes their protecting friend. And in other verses Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala establishes that people can attain this relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Meaning, for example, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala states in another place in the Holy Quran, In awliya'uhu illa al-muttaqun, that people cannot attain the wilaya of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala except through taqwa, except by being from the muttaqun. So, when we look at wilaya, there's actually, our ulama have actually divided it into two subtypes. The first type is wilaya amma, and the second type is wilaya khassa. Wilaya amma means a general wilaya, and it is a general state that every single believer enters once they enter into the deen. Wilaya khassa is a particular state, and it's a special state that's given to people through their taqwa. And this is what this ayah actually refers to. In awliya'uhu illa al-muttaqun. That a person cannot become one of the awliya except through taqwa. Illa al-muttaqun. Except by having taqwa. Now, every single aspect of the deen produces a different means of attaining wilaya. So the Prophet ﷺ established the greatest form of wilaya through his actions and through his example. And then every single deed that he did is ranked according to the ulama as to how it relates to producing wilaya. So for example, there are deeds that are mandatory within the deen. They are necessary for the deen to exist. And those deeds create the general wilaya that exists between Allah and the believers. Then there are some deeds that are supererogatory. They're the extra deeds that we perform, the things that the Prophet ﷺ established as sunnah or as mustahab. And those deeds actually produce an increase in that basic relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala until a person becomes extremely close to Allah. So these are the two types of wilaya, wilaya amma and wilaya khassa. Now for people who are aiming to become close to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, wilaya khassa is the goal. But wilaya khassa does not come except with special effort. So if you want general wilaya, it takes a general effort. And if you want particular and special wilaya, then it takes a special effort. And that's the thing to keep in mind when we analyze the sharia, when we analyze the sunnah. That every single deed that the Prophet ﷺ did, it has some effect on his relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Those deeds weren't random. Literally the way he talked, the way he walked, the way he dealt with others, the way he interacted with people in his dealings. Every single thing that the Prophet ﷺ did was a part of his wilaya, was a part of his relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So what Allah has assigned and what the Prophet ﷺ has assigned as mandatory are what is mandatory in order to produce wilaya. And then everything else is what allows wilaya to increase. And so when we choose our deeds, when we look through our lives, when we analyze ourselves, when we analyze the Quran, we analyze the Hadith, we see what our ulama have extracted from that and advised us to do, what we actually should recognize is that each of these things results in our getting closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so the ball's basically in our court. We do the mandatory things, we get the minimal relationship. And if you do what's beyond the mandatory, you get what's beyond in relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. In fact, some ulama have written it in this way. If you do the fara'id, you get the farad relationship that exists with Allah. And if you do the supererogatory acts, you gain the results of the supererogatory relationship that can exist with Allah. And so if we aim to gain wilaya, then the key is to establish the mandatory acts and then to perform the supererogatory acts. The supererogatory acts are that which result in that completeness of wilaya that every person aims to achieve. Now, when you talk about wilaya, there are effects of wilaya. And the effect of wilaya is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives people peace in this world and gives you peace in the hereafter. In fact, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala describes the awliya in the Quran, He says, "La khawfun alayhim wa la hum yahzanun," that there is no fear upon them nor do they grieve. And that is a general statement that applies both to this world and to the hereafter. They see the world as a very different place when they exist here. They don't get caught up in what we consider to be the everyday difficulties of life. They're beyond that. And when it comes to the hereafter, where the real difficulties exist, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala creates for them situations where they're able to pass the most difficult of tests. And so throughout the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala promises the muttaqeen and the people of wilaya so many different benefits, including benefits in this world and benefits in the hereafter. But all of that comes through being from among the people of taqwa, which basically means being from the people who have a wilaya khasa. So when we ask the question, how can we improve our relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the key is to attain these things that are particular within the deen. The things that we consider small are actually essential in our attaining this wilaya. So look through the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. Look through the writings of our ulama. What did they advise the people to do? What did they carry themselves? And carry those as well, because that is what then produces that special wilaya. So may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give us a tawfiq to become among those who attain wilaya khasa. Wa akhiru da'wana alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen.